Welcome to the Pipeline Online Podcast. In this episode, we have Craig Lothian, President and CEO of Lex Capital Corp. Craig has not only headed up Lex Capital, but he has been the head of numerous oil companies running under the Villanova name. He's one of the best known oil men in Saskatchewan. We're going to talk about what's happening in the world stage of the trade wars going on and how that affects Canada, as well as the recent federal election and a lot more. Good afternoon, folks. It's Brian Zinchuk and Bronwyn Eyre with the Pipeline Online Podcast, and I was really looking forward to today's guest here. We have Craig Lothian from, 11 different oil companies, he tells us. So, Bronwyn, I'll get you up here first, and Craig.
Yeah, welcome, Craig.
Hi, Bronwyn. Thanks for inviting me.
So we're going to ask Craig here to introduce himself a little bit, and there's a lot to talk about. So, Craig, have at her.
Sure. Well, I think when you're talking to a group that hail out of Southeast Saskatchewan, I should start by saying I'm from Carlisle, Saskatchewan. And Estevan was kind of like a big outing for us back in the day to get into Estevan and Weyburn. So know that part of the world pretty well. And of the oil companies, all of that kind of came about after graduating from law school. I at one time thought I wanted to be a real lawyer. I did that for a while, I guess off and on for close to 8 years. And then, maybe not surprisingly, I was doing oil and gas work for oil companies, mostly out of Calgary. And I concluded, or at least I surmised, that they were having more fun than I was, and they were certainly making a lot more money than I was. And I think I was right in both of those assumptions, certainly the fun part. So I tried to migrate, and it took a little while. I kept one foot firmly planted in a law firm for a number of years, and then, but also started to get involved in companies. The first company I was involved with was started out of Calgary. It was called Flatland Exploration, and that was around 1997, somewhere in that range, and ended up becoming the CEO of Flatland because the president at that time decided he wanted to sell. He had some personal issues that he was going through, and I think oil was a 30-year inflation adjusted low when he wanted to hit the sell button, and I decided that was probably not a great idea, a great time. So we raised a bit of money from some local investors, bought him and his Calgary investors out, and moved it to Regina. And that was really my first, I guess, foray into the C-suite in an oil company. We were able to weather a few storms, not the least of which was 9/11 occurred in that time, and sold the company to Bulldog Energy. I ended up on the board of Bulldog 1 and Bulldog 2, which were public companies. And from there, got into an opportunity to acquire a company that was run out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but most of its assets were Saskatchewan, called Keystone Petroleums. And the founder was 89 years old by the time we acquired the company through a public process. Watrous Securities did the corporate transaction for them, and that was in 2002. It's a story that, Brian, you're familiar with. We did a story on your podcast or for you some time ago. We sold that company in 2022 for a little over $90 million at the time, and we only raised $5.9 million in equity, and at $1 a share, and we paid out $13 a share in dividends, and we sold it for another $11. So that was a really good work. Yeah, that worked okay. If you could do that again and again, it was about a 25x and for our investors. So we used that platform though, because Keystone was in essence a land and royalty company. It wasn't an oil company. It did a little bit of drilling before we acquired them. We did a little bit shortly after, but we very quickly decided that we should keep Keystone as a royalty company, a non-active company, and reduce the risk. We called it our heritage asset, which we didn't think we would ever sell, but I guess never say never. And through that platform, we rolled out a series of oil companies, and we had 2 Keystone oil companies. So we raised money, drilled oil wells when successful, sold them to typically a public Alberta company. We sold 2 of them. We decided the name issue when the oil companies are called Keystone and the mothership was called Keystone was a little confusing. So my college basketball team when I was in university was Villanova. So we went with the Villanova name when we launched our 3rd E&P company out of that platform. And we really did use the platform as a base because it allowed us to take leases on our own land and somewhat at preferential terms, but certainly when you're leasing to yourself, you can get the lands you want. But it also gave us the benefit of, drilling in our own backyard. So if the wells were successful, the drilling was successful, we were creating a royalty stream for, in many cases, the same investors. And as we were talking shortly before going live, we're on the 5th Villanova iteration now, and have had some fantastic results. Villanova 1 was a 4x, Villanova 2 was a 3x, Villanova 3 was about a 3x, Villanova 4 was a one where we broke the model and raised money at a level and sold the company at a lesser level. And we can probably blame a lot of things, but
I think we were in the middle of a big downturn at that time, weren't we?
There was, and we started to get a lot of headwinds in the energy industry, and that might be a good segue for some of our additional conversations. But the one thing that when we look back at what worked and what didn't work, we were able to weather price volatility. In our industry, you pretty much expect it. You prefer to raise money when oil is low and sell when oil is high. But Villanova 1, which was almost a 4x for our investors, we raised all of the equity when oil was about $55, $56, and we sold that company to Crescent Point for $130 million roughly, and oil was $43 or $44. So we were able to do a very good job, I guess, of building the production efficiently and getting a great return for our shareholders when the only thing that we were dealing with, or one of the major things we were dealing with, was the risk of drilling and then that price volatility. What became ultimately more difficult were things that you couldn't control as well, which was essentially federal government interference in the industry and a federal government from 2015 on that really, I used to say that they, have a hidden agenda that they are trying to put the oil industry out of business, but they even surprised me by, saying the quiet part out loud and very much indicating that they viewed the oil industry as a sunset industry and one that we were going to transition away from in some sort of, unrealistic timeline that they 2030 or 2050, they kind of pick and choose, or 2035, depending on what regulations they were bringing in. But the Liberals really have done everything they can in the last 20 or 10 years, I guess, to try and kneecap the industry. And although they've tried to do that, we still think that there's been a lot of success, and the industry is still incredibly viable. It's a huge part of the Canadian economy. It's a huge part of the Saskatchewan economy, $1 billion plus in oil and gas revenue out of a, $8 billion or $21 billion provincial budget in Saskatchewan. So, and then we have additional taxes, both personal and corporate on top of that. But
so I want to throw us over to Brahma in a second, but one of the things that you're able to do here, first of all, the rigs you're going to see today, folks, this is Betts 2, which did a lot of drilling for the Villanova companies over the years. But I wanted to show this because this is what really that oil industry allows you to do. Craig, can you describe what this is?
Yeah, that's a great picture of the Promhouse family. My wife and I are co-chairing the current capital raise for the Regina Ronald McDonald House. We've had a Ronald McDonald House in Saskatoon for, I don't know, 25 plus 30 years maybe. And they've done great work up there. And I got to know Ronald McDonald House maybe more so after I became involved as the chair, or co-chair rather, Southern Corp chair of the capital campaign to build the Children's Hospital in Saskatoon. And I think the two of them are both great examples. Those two things are great examples of what the oil industry can do. When I was the co-chair of Southern Saskatchewan for the what is now the Jim Pattison Children's Hospital, at one point in time, I think there were 14 in groups, not including Jimmy Pattison, who donated over 50 million now, 50 in case people think I said 15, $50 million that he donated, which is amazing, a former Saskatchewan resident. But there were about 14 companies or individuals that had donated over $1 million. And I think the number, I used to have a picture actually on my wall that showed the donation board that now is in the atrium as you walk into that incredible facility in Saskatoon. But 11 out of 14 at one point in time, I could draw either a direct line to the oil industry in Saskatchewan or a pretty, dark gray indirect line. And the dark lines were people that I know and like the Cugna family, the Carson family, the Manill family, my family, Eldon McIntyre, who ran a very successful oil company out of Hazelett, Saskatchewan, in southwest Saskatchewan for a lot of years, and went on to live in Calgary, but he gave a significant amount of money to the Children's Hospital as well. And we then, after we did that, and our family and Keystone Royalty gave us a significant amount of money, we were asked to give some money about a year and a half or two ago to the Humane Society in Regina, and my wife and I made a significant donation to that, $1 million. And that was something near and dear, probably more to Pam's heart than mine, maybe.
That's the picture I was looking for.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Well, I like that you gave the Promos family, because that's the campaign I'm on now. But we gave $1 million to that, and now we've committed $1 million as well to Ronald McDonald. And when I have spoke at some of the events where and not most recently actually with Minister Cockrell, when we announced the start of the construction and the significant donation that the province of Saskatchewan made to that, I made a point, and I try to make this point all the time, that people always ask me why we're donating money. Why did you give that money to that entity, or why did you give that money to the Regina Humane Society? Why did you give that money to the Ronald McDonald House? And I don't think the why is really that interesting. There's just so many good causes. You could pick 20 or 30 and they'd all be great. So I'm never really interested in the why. I'm more interested in the how. And the how is because my family had the good fortune of getting involved in the Saskatchewan oil industry. And some of it was timing. We acquired Keystone in 2009. Oil was $20 some a barrel, and we sold it was 89 or something like that. So yeah, there's certainly some good luck, but it's a tremendous industry. Almost 1 million jobs in the country. Most of those jobs pay, no matter what part of the industry you're involved in, they pay 2 times the average. And certainly our shareholders, a lot of which live in Regina, some of them live outside of Regina, Estevan, Weyburn, Saskatoon, Calgary, etc. We've returned a lot of money to the investors of the Keystone and Villanova franchises. And we, have now, since 2009, we're running a private equity fund, energy fund, have raised $600 and some million in that. And my goal in doing that was to continue to do that, to continue to bring Canadian investors and Saskatchewan investors in particular into an industry that can give them great returns so they can do great things for their community. But I'll give you one little anecdote. We started Keystone, or rather the Lex Energy Fund franchise in 2009. Dean Popple, Curtis Armstrong, and I got together and decided to start it. I was the CEO originally. Dean's now the CEO. But in 2009, we raised our first fund, 100% local investors, 100% Canadian. Our second fund in 2010, 100%. 2012, we started to get a bit of interest from outside of Canada, but still 80+% was from Canada. What happened from 2015 on is the Canadian retail and in particular institutional investor went away. And our last fund, which we raised in 2022, we raised $200 million in about 2 weeks, hit the cap. We had a $200 million hard cap. We hit the $200 million hard cap in 2 weeks. Only 26% of that money came from Canada. And why is that? Why are sophisticated as well as retail, and we call it we say retail, and that's not to mean that they're not sophisticated, but they're not institutional. But why are the retail investors and the institutional investors not a single pension fund, not a single Saskatchewan pension fund, not a single federal Canadian pension fund, not a single institutional fund out of, or large institutional fund out of Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver or anywhere, Regina for that matter, is prepared to invest in energy in Canada? And yet Americans are. And we jokingly would say when we were on the road doing our presentations that we need to get in front of people that don't listen to the CBC every day. And
well, I guess Bronwyn here, she fought a lot of that fight as the energy minister for 4 years. Bronwyn, I'm sure you've got some questions here about the feds and all that interaction for Craig.
Yeah, I have lots of questions, but I mean, I think, Craig, you'd agree that over the course of the federal election campaign, there was in some ways unprecedented focus on energy, where Bill C-69, for example, or the EV regs, or the approval times, obviously the carbon tax, industrial carbon tax, all of these federal regulations were actually quite highlighted and talked about out there. But there was also this rather unfortunate trend, which was that, well, we're kind of good now because, Prime Minister Carney talks about the East-West corridor, got rid of the carbon tax, was coy about the industrial carbon tax, but has talked about keeping the oil and gas cap on and Bill C-69 in place, amended but not repealed, and so on. How do you, and you mentioned, people who might, depending on where you get your news, let's say, how would you respond to those who say that, you talk about kneecapping and how impacted investment has been in the energy sector and how impacted the energy sector has been through all these federal regulations and policies and legislation over the last 10 years, but you're still doing okay? Because that is the narrative out there, right? That Alberta's doing okay and Saskatchewan's doing okay. So what are you complaining about? I mean, you, in a way, it paradoxically leads to, because you talk about the power of the export, that it's a quarter of our exports, or how much it funds equalization, that there you go, you're doing well. How do you make that argument about the impact, the real impact that those federal policies, those anti-energy policies have had on the energy sector in Alberta and Saskatchewan, sort of on in a meat and potatoes way? Yeah,
I think you need to, unfortunately, you need to look outside of Canada to be able to understand what we could be. And yeah, is the industry profitable in Canada right now? As a shareholder, and I still have lots of holdings in the Canadian energy sector outside of, our funds and Villanova. They're very profitable, but they're profitable in spite of the federal government, and they're profitable because we've been under such duress for so long that we have literally, been able to eke out the best economics probably on the planet. We've driven our cost structures as low as probably possible, and we've moved away from utilizing debt as a tool to be able to grow. And if you want to grow quickly, leverage is the number one tool that every industry in the planet uses to grow quickly, is leverage, reasonable leverage, but leverage. And we've gone away from that model, at least in the public oil and gas space, and because of the volatility concerns about the government and the sunset argument about the industry, to returning money to shareholders through share buybacks and dividends. And, you can buy companies out there right now with 20, 30, 40-year proven reserves of oil and gas that are returning 7, 8, even 9%, probably close to 9% in dividend yields per year. And if you want to get out, you can get, there's certainly liquidity in the public market, but they're also buying back their stock. So we're doing well, but, how well could we be doing? And really, how well are we doing? When you look at, the current federal provincial debt in the country is over $2 trillion. I look at that and I go, okay, like $2 trillion in debt in a country with 40 million people, number one producer of potash, number two producer of uranium, number three or third largest reserves of oil and gas on the planet, fourth largest producer of oil in the planet, fifth largest producer of natural gas on the planet. If I tell that story, and thankfully a lot of the Americans don't seem to know much about Canada, but when you tell, I spend the winter in Scottsdale and have some good friends there, and I tell them those stats, and they go, holy cow, how much money is your government sitting on? You only have 40 million people. And they know that we've got timber and we've got fresh water and we've got critical minerals and gold and diamonds, and they go, wow, your country must be so wealthy. And then you go, well, no, and our debt to GDP is now 1.6 or 7% or 107% of our debt to GDP, and we have all this debt. And they go, well, wait a minute, how do you have all that debt? Why do you have all that debt?
Well, can you imagine, what sort of money we'd be having if we took the federal knee off the neck? And I wanted to get into the federal election here, and it's particularly the fact that Trump really threw a monkey wrench into it. I want to know what you thought about that, about his idea of bringing tariffs on everything of the 51st state and how that affected the federal election.
I'm probably not a great proxy. My wife always reminds me that I'm what is her words? Insignificant sample size of one. She says I have a tendency to say that, I say something that is only my opinion, but I say it like it's, some sort of factual statement from above. But we were in Arizona, heard the news, probably American news, that, there was tariffs going on, tariff threat, heard the 51st state comment multiple times. I thought it was laughable. I think you have to, at least by now, even Canadians have to know that, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a very high percentage of everything that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth has not been well thought out. He's done more interviews than Biden did. He did more interviews in the first week probably than Biden did in the last 4 years. So he talks, he's a negotiator. He thinks he's the best negotiator in the world, the art of the deal, blah, blah, blah. I looked at all that and thought, well, that's a nothing burger. The threat of tariffs, when that we send them 4 million barrels of oil per day, they use 12 million a day. So, we're a third. We're 97% of our oil goes down there, but we are a big chunk. At the same time, he's talking about tariffs on that oil or whatever the product is. He's also talking about he's going to lower the cost of inflation. He's going to lower the cost of, or the price of inflation, rate of inflation. He's going to lower the cost of everything. He's going to reduce the price of gas at the pumps. Well, you can't do that with putting tariffs on Canadian. So I didn't think it was going to be an issue. And then I started, paying attention, a bit more attention as it came closer to coming home and closer to getting back for the election. And I'm now hearing that the Liberals have a lead. And why do they have a lead? And when people tell me, well, the number one issue the country's facing is Trump and tariffs, and I'm like, how can you actually think that that's the number one issue facing our country? With all the things the Liberals have done wrong, and they're like too numerous to mention in a 1-hour podcast, how do you think that could possibly be the biggest issue? And yet, exit polls show for a lot of Canadians, I'm in the boomer generation, a lot of retirees felt that was the number one issue. A lot of those retirees have 35 and 40-year-old children still living in their basement who can't get jobs. And yet the biggest issue they thought the country was facing was the threat of tariffs. And no mention, or very little mention, of the 100% tariff that Canada put on EVs against China and the retaliatory tariffs that China put on, well, close to our home, canola oil, meal, and fish and pork. No one's talking about that. No. And that was way before Trump fired the first, volley on Canadian, with, on again, off again tariffs. And today the markets are all up. The Dow's up 3%. The NASDAQ's up over 3% because now U.S. and China have some sort of core deal on solving their tariff war. So the tariffs with the U.S. are going to go away. And I'm not worried. I wasn't worried about them before, and I'm not worried about them now.
Rowan?
Craig, in terms of the, where we find ourselves now and where it all goes from here, and and you mentioned a lot there, obviously, in terms of how we did get here. I'm assuming that you agree that, when we're talking reset, for example, or new relationship, or redefining federal-provincial relations and so on. I mean, from your perspective, from the energy perspective, there really is no reset unless some of those fundamental fundamentally destructive policies, regulations, and so on are lifted. Again, I'm assuming you agree. How do we get that across? How do we actually get that heard?
Well, for me, I've seen and read Mark Carney talking about on the campaign trail he wants to turn Canada into an energy superpower, and certainly that would. I'd love to see that happen. We have all the tools to be able to do that, but it's easier to say that when he's maybe out in Western Canada campaigning or skating around with an Oilers jersey on at one of their practices. But I think until the first signal to me, I think will be, is Stephen Guilbeault going to be in the cabinet?
Right on.
I think he's putting his new cabinet in place tomorrow. If Stephen Guilbeault has any significant role in that cabinet, I don't believe that we will take any of those required steps towards becoming that energy superpower.
And I would suggest Jonathan Wilkinson. Two toxic ministers in terms of the sector. I'm looking for those two because they've been such definers. I mean, not so much Guilbeault, but Wilkinson certainly redefined himself and pivoted very quickly when he saw the writing on the wall. But he was an architect, and so I agree with you.
Yeah, and I'm actually more upset with him probably than I am Guilbeault, because I think Guilbeault is an environmental zealot. He's been that his whole life, but Wilkinson likes to remind everyone that he's from Saskatchewan, and his wife is from Saskatchewan, or they lived in Saskatchewan, and then he does everything he can to, stick it to Saskatchewan at every term. And the other thing when I'm talking people about what we lead in, the number one on potash is important maybe, but I think number one, we, at least federally, we lead in hypocrisy. If there is a more hypocritical group on the planet than the federal Liberals when, we're eliminating oil, we're eliminating single-use plastics, we're doing all of these minor things for the 1.4% of emissions that Canada represents to the world, which is nothing. We could fall off the map tomorrow and go to zero, and it would mean no different. But at the same time, Jonathan Wilkinson's province of British Columbia, new province of British Columbia, Port of Vancouver is the number one or one of the top coal exporters on the planet. And 75% of all the coal that they like to talk about, well, a lot of it's metallurgical coal, we need it for steel. No, most of what they're shipping is thermal coal. And 75 or 80% of that all comes from the US. Because states of Washington and California have said, hey, to protect the environment, we can't ship coal out of here anymore. We're not going to allow coal shipments out of our two states. So they rail it up to Vancouver, to British Columbia, where wide swaths of British Columbia would be very, very happy to see the end of the oil and gas industry. And yet shipping coal, which coal is what, five or six times the greenhouse gas emissions of natural gas. Like if they had an LNG terminal, we could be the leader in reducing emissions. If you're really worried about greenhouse gases, we could be the leader in reducing greenhouse gas emissions for the entire planet if we would just move forward more quickly with more than one LNG terminal. We have one coming on shortly. That's great, but get rid of the coal shipments and start moving LNG.
So time's going by pretty quick here. We're already half hour in, and I still got a lot of things on my list to go. Craig, if you have a little bit extra time to go over, we can if you're willing.
Sure.
I'm just going to pull up our ad here from Grimes Sales and Service. I think you guys bought a few pump jacks from them over the years.
We got a few bent pump jacks, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. There's a reason the HG jack has dominated Saskatchewan's oil patch. That's because that distinctive curved walking beam reduces energy consumption by about 25%. That means 25% less power bills, 25% less carbon tax. That's a big difference. And it's available exclusively from Grimes Sales and Service, Lothian, Saskatchewan. So I wanted to get here into first the CEO letter, and then what came of that shortly thereafter, the election, which was Premier Smith's response, I guess, to the federal election. So the CEOs, the 14 biggest CEOs of energy companies, pipeline companies, put out a letter saying that they wanted to simplify regulation, a commitment to firm deadlines for project approvals, and we're talking pipelines here and oil sands. They want to grow production, attract investment, and incent Indigenous co-investment opportunities, such as pipelines or other projects. Craig, can you speak to those?
They're all admirable aspirational goals for sure. One of the problems I have with that CEO's letter is that a lot of the same CEOs, or at least the same companies, were also standing shoulder to shoulder with Premier Notley and the federal government when they put in the original CO2 emissions and the carbon tax, and telling us how, we need to do this and we're going to lead the planet in decarbonization, and it's going to be good for you. It's going to taste bad, but it's going to be good for you. So it's interesting to see some of those companies, and in a couple of cases, the same CEO now penning another letter saying, we have to move forward with increased production. We have to, work better and harder in terms of environmental, but really kind of moving and distancing themselves away from the carbon tax, which was supposed to, be good for the country, good for the planet, good for all of us, because we were going to get more money back than we paid, which obviously should have started with a once upon a time trailer on that one. But
I completely agree with you. I was just, and I've written about this too. It was frustrating all those years that some of this some of these calls for energy superpower status, some of these calls for scrapping regulation didn't come sooner because, instead there was a lot of effort, as you'll know, on the Pathways Alliance, oil sands, carbon capture and storage efforts. It was all about getting money from the federal government and a wariness about actually sticking their necks out. And I think it's a fair enough point to say, it's better late than never, but it is late when it comes to the calls they're making now. And I mean, I remember even on Bill C-69, for example, at one time, it was difficult to get the companies to not want to try to amend paragraph by paragraph by paragraph, rather than just call for it to be scrapped, that sort of thing. Yeah. And so I share your view on that one.
Well, I remember when you and the government that you were part of were the only voice in Canada that was opposed to the lunacy of Canada, a country that has extremes of weather unlike almost any other, and we are the only oil producing country that has had a carbon tax, and we seem to be the only one that I'm familiar with that has really, it's this self-flagellation where we're trying to beat ourselves and feel good about the fact that yes, it's hurting, but look at how we're saving the planet, we're doing our part. Well, our part is so minuscule in the scheme of things. And for people that travel, I know every time I come back home, the first thing I do is, I probably don't get groceries very often, but I'll use groceries as an example, and Pam will laugh when she hears this. But if I go for groceries when I first get back, and I march into the store, and the very first thing I realize is, as I look around, everyone else is carrying a bag with them into the store. Well, I've just been in the United States for 4+ months where how many plastic bags you want, here, let me double and triple bag the milk because it might tear. And yet here we are. And, Regina, great example, in the city of Regina, in its wisdom, we didn't wait for the federal government to put in regulations saying you couldn't have plastic bags. We decided we were going to be so woke that we were going to get ahead of that. And I remembered the days when I could, if I went to one store in Regina, you would get plastic bags or you wouldn't. And then suddenly no one had any in Regina. But if you went to Emerald Park, which most people have a hard time seeing where Regina starts and Emerald Park begins or ends, you could get plastic bags in Emerald Park for a year. You could get it. And you could go to Toronto and you can get a plastic bag. Uh-huh. So, I think it's part of the Canadian psyche that we don't have the confidence, or it takes a lot of confidence sometimes to say, I don't care that everyone else is marching in this direction. I have the confidence to just say that doesn't make sense for me or for us. And I'm not going to follow that fashion, or I'm not going to follow that trend, or whatever it is. And, it became trendy to be woke and trendy to at least sound like an environmentalist. And in true Canadian form, we went rushing into it. But, for the most part, let's face it, we haven't changed. We haven't had all of the carbon taxes in the world. We haven't changed our emissions at all. In fact, they've actually gone up, I understand. I don't think the plastic bags floating and the straws floating in any of the oceans, for sure, they didn't come from Saskatchewan. So I think, until the large emitters, the large polluters are going to do something, then, we would probably have been prudent to wait for them to move. And I've said to people, I think Canadians need to make a decision. Do they want to be wealthy, or do they want to be woke? And wealthy's better, because wealthy allows you to spend on the things that are really, really important, like healthcare.
So on that note here, I wanted to touch on step forward to a week ago. So the election's over. The Carney is about to go to the Trump the following day, and Premier Smith goes on air and does an 18-minute speech, which, depending on how you count, she says 9 points, but I figure each pipeline deserves the points. Maybe there's 11 points here, but she's got essentially 11 demands that says that if you don't do this, and we see action within 6 months, not necessarily separation, but separation if necessary. She didn't say those words. I did, as riffing on the conscription crisis, but that's basically what she laid out. And Craig, I'm just going to bring up each point here to do a quick hit on each one of them. So first, he said pipelines to the Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic Ocean. What are your thoughts?
I'd take any one of them. If they could accomplish one of those three, that would be great. But are we going to get an energy corridor? Certainly, that was something that the Conservatives were saying was, big part of their platform, and it's getting to be difficult, at least from afar. It was hard to see where the platforms. There's not a lot of daylight at times because it seemed like every one of the things that was really probably important, at least to Western Canada, Carney said, "Well, yeah, I'll do that too. We'll become an energy superpower, and we're going to build, baby, build."
Well, and on that front here, so the next point is, some of these are taken directly from her speech, seeing the federal government end all federal interference in the development of provincial resources by repealing the No Pipelines Law C-69.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that'll be the first, and I think Premier Moe has said the same things to the federal government, that I think he may have put it in the form of a rewrite, that I think that maybe Bronwyn, it might have dated back to your time even, that the province was working on trying to come up with a revised version that would be more palatable to the federal government, but still allow for development. And with C-69 in place, there will not be another pipeline. And if they only tinker with it, there won't be another pipeline, because there won't be a company or management team of that company that would have the audacity or the courage to step in front of the 4 or 5 year process that it's going to take to get that pipeline.
Well, I'll just add really quickly on Bill C-69. I mean, certainly when I was still there, the messaging was scrap. The problem with tweaking or amending is that's what Guilbeault was working on. And you get into that as soon as you get into that thing about tweaking or rewriting or amending, when it was already held to violate the Constitution. I mean, it's a constitutional violation according to the Supreme Court. So as Guilbeault said, okay, well, I hear that. Now I'm going to work on a different thing. The bottom line is they just don't really have the right to do it, because it's not their turf. It's, fisheries and migratory birds is their turf, and that's how it was before. And Enbridge Line 3 replacement got done before Bill C-69, and you don't need it. So it's very concerning to me that Carney's, been really reserved judgment on Bill C, because you get into tweaking and you just go down the same road.
The next point was the oil tanker ban to be repealed.
Yeah, well, how do you build Northern Gateway if you can't have a tanker pick up the oil when it gets there? It's and again, it's a Canadian ideology, running ahead of pragmatism. So, I liken that to we've declared our end of the pool the non-peeing end of the pool, but Alaska's in the other end of the pool, and there's tankers going in and out of there all the time. So, but don't worry, BC, because we're not going to allow any tankers to actually come up to our coast. They go by. You can see them.
Uh-huh.
You can see them go by all the time. So but we've declared our end the non-peeing end of the pool. So we're all good here in northern BC. So
maybe we have a non-peeing atmosphere as well, because the next point is oil and gas emissions cap.
Yeah, no, and which emissions cap equals production cap, because nobody can, you can't cut your emissions to the levels that they're talking about without capping production. So, call it what it is. Let's not sugarcoat it. Just say, we've decided that we don't want to produce any more oil in Canada than, this baseline mark, but then say, okay, well, what does that mean? What it means is they're going to get the oil from somewhere else. 110, we're 109, 108.9 million barrels of oil per day. Demand currently, it's gone up 1 million barrels a year almost, or a little more over the last 4 or 5. It's going to continue to grow, at least for the foreseeable future. And the oil is going to come from somewhere. So, Venezuela, Nigeria, Russia, Saudi, UAE, it is going to come out of the ground from somewhere. So is that what we want as Canadians? Do we want to have to get the world to get the oil from other countries? And I can tell you that those countries, the ones that I'm familiar with, do not have anywhere near the level of environmental compliance or regulations, and they don't have the human rights record that Canada does. They certainly don't, most of those countries don't have the level of Indigenous employment that we have, or the level of, female employees that we have. A lot of those countries, women don't work. Women aren't allowed to work.
My daughter's turning wrenches at Jerry Manil's. So
yes, exactly.
Next point is the net zero electricity regulations, or the clean electricity regulations.
Yeah, I'm at the point where I've lost track. When you asked me about that, I went, oh, okay, well, wait, what is that again? But you don't even have to, it's just another example of Canada saying, well, we're going to try and, commit economic hara-kiri to try and save the planet from the 1.4% of total global greenhouse gas emissions.
On their explanation of that is that for people who haven't been following or been writing about this, the idea is that we are not going to emit anything from our power generation, so we can't burn anything. Originally it's 2035, now it's 2050. Well, a few weeks ago, Alberta had 94% of its power coming from natural gas. So if you follow those regulations, so let's put carbon capture on all 50 or some power generating plants they have on every unit. The reality is that Alberta would have been freezing. Well, it actually wouldn't be that cold. It just would have been in the dark for half a day. Next point here is you already touched on this a little bit. Any federal law regulation that purports to regulate industrial carbon emissions and plastics. So you touched on the bags. I really wanted to get your thought on this commercial free speech of energy companies, because I've been fighting Bill C-59 really hard. I've been screaming a lot louder than people who have entire floors of lawyers who haven't said a damn thing, and they shut down their website because, oh my God, we can't say anything against the feds now. What are your thoughts on that, Craig?
I can't imagine that would ever survive a free speech challenge under the Constitution. And it's been a long time since I took constitutional 101 in law school. So, but it just tells you the extent that this Liberal government, or at least the last Liberal government, wanted to control not just reality, but the perception that we can't have oil companies talking about how Canadian oil companies are the most sustainable, the most environmentally friendly, the most highly regulated, employ the most Indigenous people, we have great paying jobs. We can't have them saying good things, because it goes against our narrative that they're all evil and bad and we have to get rid of them. And, so if I would have told either one of you or anyone else 20 years ago or 10 years ago even, that we would have a federal government in this country who was going to go to that kind of level and extent to handicap an industry that is such a big part of our GDP, you would have gone, well, that's ridiculous. There's no way they would do that. But it's in the industry, you literally almost have to laugh, because the alternative is you cry. They would bring out new regs and new, I remember when I first heard about the methane restrictions and what that was going to mean, and then the emissions restrictions and the cap, and it's just, it literally is one thing after another. But my answer to all of these is, do we have a federal government that is prepared to let people freeze to death? Because that is the alternative. Without baseload power generation, Spain and Portugal, southern Spain and Portugal had a big, total brownout because they have gone so far in converting to wind and solar, and then found out what happens if they have a bit of a blip on that, and you don't have baseload backup. And the only baseload backup that you can actually flick on when needed is natural gas, or coal, or heating oil. But natural gas is certainly, the world is moving to natural gas as the preferred power generation source on the planet. And when we look at what we're using now currently to generate of natural gas, and what the world is moving to, Europe, insatiable demand for LNG, Asia, insatiable demand for LNG, just for where they are right now. But where are we moving with the whole power requirement for AI, and the amount of additional power demand that is required there? We have AI companies in the US who are buying or building their own nuclear power generation capacity because they know how much energy they're going to need. But that's 10 to 15 to 20 years out. It's decades long process to get more nuclear power. So in the meantime, the US is moving to LNG and natural gas. And we're going to have to as well, or we're going to fall behind on all of those things. AI, we're going to fall further behind in our competitiveness. And I know that our GDP over the last 10 years has been a laggard at best. US is 20+% growth in the last 10 years. We've had 0.5 real GDP growth, at basically nothing. Well, if we don't have the power to power our industry, we're going to fall further and further behind. But we are also going to have brownouts. And what does that mean in Saskatchewan? Well, yesterday or a day ago would have been uncomfortably warm. But for about 3 months or 4 months of the year, it's going to be deadly, as in too cold.
Yeah.
And Alberta actually had that about a year and a half ago,
where we had to bring power in from outside the.
No, they actually had a brownouts. They actually started cutting out power for 20 minutes in Edmonton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Craig, I know Brian wants to talk a bit about oil production goals and targets and so on that the Premier has set for Saskatchewan. Just before we get to that, can you give us a little bit of a snapshot from your perspective of the state of the sector in Saskatchewan and the players? We've seen some shifts, and just wouldn't mind your take on the changes that have been, the things that have changed, the things that have stayed the same, and sort of where we're at in terms of the sector here.
Yeah.
Whitecap closed their deal with Varen / Crescent Point today.
That kind of stuff.
I'm still a large shareholder now of Whitecap because as I mentioned, we sold Villanova 1 to Crescent Point. And Crescent Point was a huge part of the success story of Keystone, because I think we had 200 and some leases that we had with Crescent Point as the Bakken play rolled through in 08, 09. The industry I think is doing reasonably well, but in taking a look today at what we're producing in the province, I think it's just under 500,000 barrels of oil per day. I pulled up some of the Lex presentations from the funds that we raised from 2009 through to our last one in 2022, and the numbers basically the same. It's since the Bakken boom, where we had a bit of a spike. If you take out that blip from the Bakken, we seem to be always in and around the 400,000 to 500,000 barrel a day range, and a lot of new technology has been a part of being able to maintain that. I don't personally think that it's realistic that we will ever be able to materially exceed that. I don't think that Premier Moe didn't ask me. And again, he would remind me maybe that I'm a insignificant sample size of one, but I think that's not realistic. And I think, if we can maintain it in and around the 400,000 barrel a day mark, that's probably going to be pretty successful. The easy barrels have clearly been found. We're, the new lateral well program and the royalty structure that the government put in to incent further lateral drilling, whether it's, the fishbone or pitchfork approach, has certainly been very helpful to the industry and made some of those wells more economic to drill. But I don't believe that there is a likelihood of a big oil and gas increase coming out of Canada.
So I guess that did get into something I didn't want to talk about, which is since 2019, the Saskatchewan Party government has talked about a 600,000 barrel per day goal, and I've kind of been needling them for the past few years, saying, "Hey, okay, what are you going to do to make it happen?" And we have seen the multilateral program last year, the well reactivation program this year, and I actually gave a speech in Calgary about possibly a way we could hit 1 million by talking about CO2, enhanced oil recovery, maybe oil sands, more SAGD. Do you don't think that we can hit 600,000 barrels? And Premier Moe said during the election last year, I asked him, and he said, "Well, maybe we can hit 1 million." Do you think that it's totally out to lunch on that? Or if we had the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, if we had the capital to put more into SAGD in Northwest Saskatchewan, you don't think we can get more than that?
You'd have to open up your crystal ball and tell me what the price of oil is. If we went into a period of very high oil prices, which I think we are going to get to that point, because I think we're going to peak. Supply is going to peak before demand will, and I think we're already seeing there's been no growth out in the non-OPEC world. There's been no growth in the last 10 years outside of the shale Permian basin in the U.S., and everyone else has been flattish at best. And we've been through some pretty high oil prices in that time, and we still haven't seen that material growth outside of the Permian. There's certainly lots of empirical data that the big shale production boom in the U.S. is over, and their production is starting to decline, certainly flattening. They're running out of their best tier 1 locations, and the companies themselves are even talking about that. And Trump talks a lot about drill baby drill, and how we don't need Canadian oil, we got all the black gold under our feet. And yet the oil companies that are literally going to be the mechanism to be able to make that happen or not are saying, no, we don't have that. What we have is a industry that we're hoping to, be able to continue to return value to our shareholders. We're not likely to take on significant amounts of drilling, and we don't see growth, material growth. We talk, companies get excited about, we're going to increase our production by 1%, 2%, 5%. But there are many oil companies out there that are talking about increasing their production by 10 or 20% per year, year over year.
Well, there is one actually in Northwest Saskatchewan. Strathcona's got 48,000 barrels of growth planned between now and 2030.
Yeah, and Ron, when you asked, what do I see in terms of the industry in the province, it's changed a lot. We had a very, very successful run through a number of companies where we were serial sellers, and we were building and flipping oil companies, growing them from 0 to 1,000 to 2,000 barrels a day, selling it. In some cases, we sold 3 companies in 5 years, and that's great for shareholders, hard on staff, but great for shareholders. But that was the kind of, I think, we had the scalable, available resource assets, land and reserves under the land to be able to do that. Our funds have and we were champions. And you know, I'm pausing because I even hate to say this part out loud, but we were champions of the Saskatchewan oil sector and the availability of land in the province, ease of access. You know, talked about all the roads and the great grid system we have in our transmission facilities and pipelines and everything else. We now, you know, as a institutional manager of other people's money, a large chunk of that of which is institutions out of the U.S., we view Saskatchewan not as a place where you can, you know, build certainly a public company opportunity now, but more of a spot where you come in and you do consolidation. You buy out, you bring new capital, because the biggest impact of what the feds have done is they have completely dried up the availability of public capital, public markets capital to the sector. And, you know, not 100%, but certainly to a trickle from where it was. What we can bring is big private equity, patient, long-term investable dollars, mostly from U.S. investors, unfortunately, two management teams that are looking to come into Saskatchewan, consolidate assets, and buy something that might be long in the tooth, something that's been overlooked by the public company that has held it for a number of years. And you know, we did that with Woodland, where we led that offering, and they bought a bunch of old Penn West assets, and we approved another deal very recently that is going to buy up some existing assets, and same strategy that, you know, basically Woodland and brought it to bear, which is bring in a bunch of private equity and bring in some debt, but bank debt that is tied to hedges, and look to clean it up and strip out royalty or dividends for shareholders. But not, you know, in most cases, we're not even looking at a growth model. I don't like to use the term blowdown because it, you know, sounds worse than it is, but letting the assets decline moderately if necessary, flat preferably, but moderately if necessary, and strip out cash flow to pay down the debt, get a return to your shareholders, probably in the form of a dividend, and maybe ultimately and clean up the environmental, you know, long-term legacy environmental ARO requirements, to the point that maybe it is clean enough and flat enough, declining the decline rate is going to be low enough that a public company may in fact look at picking that up down the road. But that's a different, you know, that isn't the excitement of 0 to 2000, the excitement of, you know, every piece of ground in southern Saskatchewan having Bakken production potentially under it. And I think we drilled 58 wells in Villanova 1. We actually had, I think we might have been the only company to drill 2 dry holes, or not dry, but unsuccessful Bakken wells in about 2009. Everyone else had production, and we were new to the game, and our partner, public company partner, was new to the game, and we overfracked and ended up with a whole bunch of water and no oil. But other than that,
we drilled a couple of disposal wells. What you said?
Yeah, 56 out of 58 is a pretty good record.
So Brahman, here, one more shot here. I got a couple things to wrap up beforehand.
You go ahead, Brian. I'm good.
All right. So I did want to get over here. You know, talking about Villanova 5. You said you're looking at drilling some wells here. I did want to ask you, because I'm starting to hear from a variety of service companies that oil was $58 last week. I think it's $62 yesterday or today. We're reaching a threshold where companies are pulling back their budgets. They're asking for vendor rates to be cut again, you know, after 10 years or 7 years of downturn from 14 to 21. Can you tell me, you know, what your activity is and what do you have planned for this year?
Yeah, we're I think our capex at Villanova is in the 10 wells at about 1.25 million drilled, completed, equipped and tied in. So 15 million CapEx. And that was, we modified our budget. We reduced it somewhat. We had our last meeting first week of May, I believe, end of April, first week of May. And we pulled back a little bit with the drop in price. And, but part of the drop in WTI forecast was offset by initially at least a weaker Canadian dollar than what we were forecasting. We did increase, I know our budget took a bit of a hit because we had to increase pipe steel costs because of tariff concerns. And I think we were seeing, even though the tariffs were on again, off again, I think they were off by that time, seemed like the suppliers had increased their prices regardless of whether they were on or off. But I think companies, the best part about the industry now, and it's, how do you survive 10 years of Liberal government? Well, you survive by becoming really, really good at your business. And, if an oil company is still around today, this, maybe has been here for 10 years, and Villanova's at least 6 or 7 years into the current iteration, we're really good at reacting quickly. We'll pull back drilling if we don't like the price or if we think that the drilling costs are too high. And alternatively, if oil prices jump up, we'll be quick to apply more capital. And the industry it's always been the best part about the Saskatchewan oil patch is that one time we used to only jokingly say we'd spend about 150% of every dollar we made. And we did. So
I just want to bring my son in here because he just walked in the door from the Oil and Gas 20 program where he's doing, we head down here a little bit, work placements with Whitecap out near Lampman today. And this is the future of the patch here. Is that the Oil and Gas 20 program, I think, is wonderful. Are you guys involved with any of Villanova doing any work placements like that?
Not that I'm aware of, but I would certainly hope that we would look at doing that. We hire, I guess I said no, and then I should say yes. We hire a summer student from typically the University of Regina. We have hired one from the University of Saskatchewan every year. We hired a summer student during the COVID year when we didn't have any work for anybody, but we always looked at it as part of the right thing to do, to hire those young people. But I'm also happy to say that 2 or 3 of those summer students have gone on to be full-time employees. And in fact, the current CEO of Villanova, the 5th Villanova company, Andrew Spagrud, we hired him fresh out of the University of Saskatchewan from the engineering program up there. So yeah, we try to grow, and I'm really glad to see your son in that program, and I gave a big shout out to that program on social media when I saw that they were doing it. I've spoken at schools off and on over the last 15 years, and I always did a little thing. I did it several times when my kids were going to high school. I would go in and do a little speech on mostly to a business class. It's not an energy class, but a business class. And before I started, I had the teacher hand out a little, slips of paper and say, can you write down the top 2 or 3 things that you're thinking of doing when you graduate, whether it's graduate from high school or ultimately graduate from university. And I don't remember the statistics now, so I can make them up. But I do remember that.
You should work for CBC.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't know, just make it up. But I know that not one of the people before I talked said that they wanted to work for the oil industry and that was at Campbell Collegiate at a time when oil was, I think, about $108 or $109 a barrel.
Spencer, can you say what you did today?
Today I woke up at 5:30 in the morning and then got picked up at my house, and I was going around looking at pump jacks and wells and making sure everything was fine. And we actually had, when we actually got out there for today, one of the red lights on a building was actually frozen. So we had to go fix that and check what the alarm was. So we were just driving around getting data and checking if all the pump jacks and everything was working perfectly fine.
So he was out with a field operator for Whitecap, and his goal is to be a journeyman electrician in a few years.
Yeah.
Good work.
All right, folks, I think it's time to wrap up here. We've taken more of Craig's time than we planned. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness here, and I mean, we could probably go for a couple hours, but Craig, you're so full of information that you've done this for a long time, and we'd love to get you on in the future. If there's anything, Raman, you wanted to add?
No, just want to thank you, Craig. It was really interesting and lots of great insights. So appreciate it very, very much. Thank you so much for joining us today.
If I get one more comment, I'll add it because it'll stop maybe a few of the inbound criticisms that I'm going to get on social media. It seems like every time I go on anything or put a tweet out or an X out or whatever and say something good about the industry, I get a lot of hate probably from Eastern Canada. But I like to tell people, I had somebody say, well, tell me something about you that we don't know. We know you, we know you've been in the oil industry, you used to be a lawyer. And I said, well, okay, well, here's something you don't know about me. I have 36 solar panels on the roof of my house in Regina. They've been there for about 6 or 7 years. I have another 24 solar panels, ground mount solar panels on at a ranch that I have outside of Regina. And I have to go ranch because I don't have any horses or cattle out there, not yet anyway. And we are a significant investor in a commercial solar installation company in Ontario. And then the one that I'm, equally excited about, we are also, we're not probably the largest investor, but we're certainly in the top 3 or 4 largest investors in the deep geothermal project down in southeast Saskatchewan, which unlike wind and solar, geothermal is base load energy. It's 24/7, 365, and it will be able to provide some of that transitionary power that we at least the Liberals like to talk about. So I'm not just oil, I'm not just gas. I'm a believer in all energies and all sources, and we're going to need all of them. And I think my personal single largest investor is in Cameco. So I'm also invested in uranium. So there, for all the people that are going to hate me because I'm in the oil industry, maybe don't hate me quite so much.
Although next time I see you, I'll trade you some of my contraband plastic bags.
Yeah, I have a few of them. I love the look on the face of, and this is a true story, so I'm not making this up, the blue-haired young lady who, when she asked me if I needed to buy a bag at Save-On, I said, no, that's good. I've got my own. And I pulled out, I think, 4 Target bags that I probably obviously brought back from the States. And she looked like she wanted to not take my business there at that particular time. But you can fit them in
about
your
the
pocket.
solar panels.
Yeah.
All right, folks, thank you very much. 2 weeks from now, we're looking forward to having Ken From, former CEO of Sask Energy, and he's also run an oil company or two along the way in the PTRC. And talking, hopefully we'll get down the road here. Chris Kiefer, who's one of the nuclear energy advocates. He's a big advocate for nuclear energy. We've been talking a bit about SMRs, and he really likes the CANDU. I'm not so sure if he likes your Cameco's, what do you call them? Westinghouse. You own 49% of Westinghouse. But we're going to try to get him on to talk about nuclear because we had a big story last week. Didn't get as much press as I'd hoped, in that if we want to build 4 reactors here, Ontario is spending $21 billion to build 4 reactors of type Sask Power is looking at. So that's going to be something for down the road, hopefully in the coming months. Thank you very much, folks, and have a good day.
Thank you.